Rodger, thanks for being here. For everyone, today we have the pleasure of speaking with Rodger Brown, who's the Managing Director of Real Estate Development at the Preservation of Affordable Housing. To kick it off, your career journey has taken you from Boston College to a leadership role in affordable housing. To start, could you walk us through how your early experiences shaped your path toward affordable housing development and speak to why you decided to stay in the industry?
So I went to work for a tech company, for IBM. Back in those days, the computer industry was a little bit different. I worked in downtown Boston selling very large computers to insurance companies and banks. And after about 2 years of doing that, I realized I didn't really want to grow up to be a computer salesman. It was interesting to learn about the technology and to learn how to do public speaking and interviewing executives to figure out their business needs. But at the end of the day, it wasn't anything that I was creating. So I came back to BC and talked to some professors and one of my deans who suggested, after some conversations, that I should explore things that allowed me to be more creative on a day-to-day basis. And that started with 2 conversations with professors at MIT, and from there, some volunteer activities in the planning office in the city of Boston. And again, through coincidence, meeting some more people at MIT who provided me with an opportunity to get a fellowship for 2 years in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. And that gave me the opportunity to really explore city planning and real estate development. As part of my fellowship, I had to work 1 day a week in a governmental entity or a nonprofit, and I chose a nonprofit in the south end of Boston. It gave me the opportunity to acquire buildings, manage a small crew doing rehab, and from there I got recruited to work for an organization that's now called the Community Builders. Community Builders is a very large nonprofit that's active in the eastern half of the United States, doing affordable housing and economic development projects. I was there for a little while, and then I got recruited by a local builder in Boston to come and do real estate development for him in the city. And that was interesting. He was the largest minority contractor in the city. And we did real estate development in Boston and in Florida. And I was there for 7 years until the economic downturn. And one of the people who was a career advisor for me was a guy named Howard Cohen, who's a very smart real estate attorney who was in a law firm downtown. And so a lot of developers were experiencing contraction because of economic downturn. And a lot of them had projects that needed to be worked out financially, and I was good with the financial modeling. So he brought me on to work with his development clients and to give me a platform to see across the real estate industry in the city of Boston. And so that's what I did for a couple of years and worked with a lot of different developers, one of whom offered me the opportunity to come to be a vice president of development there, and primarily focused on a very large public housing redevelopment in the city of Boston called Mission Main. If you know that, it's close to Northeastern. And so I was a project director of that for a couple years, and it wasn't exactly working for a large private developer. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. It was pretty constraining in some ways, and so I had a platform at that particular time that allowed me to go out and work for myself. I developed some expertise in financial structuring of real estate transactions and some familiarity with public housing. And so I was able to use that acquired knowledge to provide financial consulting services to a range of nonprofits and public housing authorities, mostly in the eastern half of the United States. And ultimately, one of my clients, Preservation of Affordable Housing, asked me to come in-house and do real estate development for them. And that was kind of 20 years ago. That's the long and torturous journey.
That's great. Thanks for sharing.
All right, so across your years in the field, how have you seen the real estate development and affordable housing landscapes change? Has your opinion on the field changed at all, and what trends do you see shaping the future of affordable housing, specifically in urban areas such as Boston?
Wow. I'd say the biggest change for me is first the visibility of affordable housing, or the lack of affordable housing, and the critical nature of it in almost every major American city that I work in. We work in, from Boston to Miami, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. And in all of those cities, there is really a lack of affordable housing at almost every income level. So, when I started out, that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, in the city of Boston, we were privileged to have, a big triple-decker inventory of housing. A lot of other cities don't have that, but we have that here. And back in the day, those were great starter homes. You could buy a triple-decker, rent out 2 units, and live in one, and be able to start out. Those houses, in some cases, have increased in value 10 times in a very short period of time because of the availability of, or the desire of people with money to invest in them, not necessarily homeowners, but private equity that's looking for return will buy those assets, and they become not available to first-time home buyers and people in the neighborhood. So that's a really huge change. I would say also the cost to produce affordable housing has gone sky high. I mean, and some of it is the result of good things, and some of it is just demand. Construction costs are way up, particularly after the pandemic. I'd say that we have a lot more regulatory constraints that require us to do more work. For example, in the areas of sustainability, environmental protection, employment. All those requirements kind of layer on costs that have caused the price of affordable housing to go way up, particularly in the Boston area. I was on the phone this morning with some folks up in New Hampshire, and they have the ability to produce affordable housing at the $300,000 a unit range. In the city of Boston now, that number for us is somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million a unit. Which is eye-popping, to say the least. And that's a really huge change. I'd say we're gonna, when I started out, there wasn't a YIMBY movement at all. Yes, in my backyard, that was not a thing. And in the last 5 years, that's really become a thing in a lot of communities that are welcoming us, and we get calls from a lot of suburban communities to come and look at the opportunities to create affordable housing. 10 years ago, we didn't get that many calls to do that. I'd also say, recently there's been there will continue to be a lot of change in the building technologies that we'll use. I mean, I heard someone give a talk that said if you took a carpenter from 100 years ago and you dropped him on a building site today that's building with wood, he would basically see that technology and know how to build that building. That's going to change. We're going to have more factory built because we have a lack of labor force, which is also a new development. Not that many people are going into the trades. We need way more tradesmen. There's a whole generation of people that are going to be retiring, and we need to be able to replenish that workforce if we're going to have a chance at producing the number of units we need at a cost that we can afford.
Thank you.
Do you think the increase in technology will be able to cover the lack of tradesmen that are coming into the
It's going to
labor
take
force?
a while, but it will.
Over time?
Over time. It has to be adopted. We're doing a project now in Somerville where we're building with a company that came to do this project from the Netherlands. The guys that are the founders of that company have experience building with ship containers around the world. And using that particular technology, they've built in Europe and in the Far East. It's not something that we've really done in Massachusetts before, so they came here, they built the factory, and they're building basically apartment in boxes. It's almost the shape of a sea container, but they're not. They're actually building it from scratch using light concrete and steel in a factory in Littleton, and they put it on a truck and they're driving it to the site. And as we sit here, they're stacking those boxes, which into ultimately what will be a 10-story affordable housing development.
Wow, that's impressive. So as the managing director of real estate development, currently the preservation of affordable housing has a portfolio of over 13,000 units. So you can speak to your team in particular or the entire organization, but I'm interested to know what role the preservation of affordable housing plays in the life cycle of an asset. So are you guys mostly working like on ground up developments, or do you convert existing structures into affordable units? And then who are like the main external stakeholders that you're normally working with?
All right, well, when we started out with a portfolio of properties in Missouri. We are actually a spinoff of a financial intermediary called the National Equity Fund. That is a nonprofit financial intermediary that is itself affiliated with a nonprofit called the Local Initiative Support Corporation. For a moment in time, the National Equity Fund they're providing capital to people doing affordable housing, and for a moment in time, their board of directors thought that maybe we should be in the real estate development business. So they bought a troubled portfolio in Missouri, and they thought they would own that, operate it, and use it as a platform to build a company. They quickly found out that being a financial intermediary is a lot different than being an owner. The financial intermediary does not get calls at 2 o'clock in the morning asked to come and fix the toilet. So they decided to get out of that business, and some of their board members took the opportunity to say, let's form a nonprofit. That nonprofit was Preservation of Affordable Housing. In the beginning, we worked with those existing assets. We did financial engineering and public policy advocacy to develop financial programs at the federal level that would allow us to do the financial engineering necessary to preserve those houses, because there was a chance that they could have been flipped the market. There's a question later on about that. Anyway, we did that, and because of the financial engineering experience that we had doing that and the legislative and policy changes we were able to make at a federal level, we were able to export that financial engineering expertise to other places in the country. And that's how we started, with buying existing apartment buildings that were either going to be lost because they were in strong markets and the owners had incentives to get rid of affordability restrictions and rent in the open market. And the second class of properties were properties that had really bad owners and that were at risk of being lost to the affordable housing portfolio because they would be condemned and people would be moved out. So we had those two buckets of properties that we were working with. And then in about 2008, we got invited to talk to a resident organization in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and I sent you a little article about that. They had a very troubled property located in New Bedford. It was physically obsolescent. It had some social problems because of the physical configuration of the project itself. It was 200 units on one city block, a super block. Police could not get in. There was poor visibility, so they asked us to help them restructure their property. And so, partnering with them and the city of New Bedford, we redesigned the community. We had a planning process. We worked with the state to get funding to put in new roads and new infrastructure to make regular city blocks. We reconfigured some of the existing buildings and built new buildings so that every unit had a door on the street. The idea was to have a front door and a back door for everybody's residential unit and to have eyes on the street so that people could feel secure in their in their neighborhood. That took us about 3 years. I think it's a $50 to $70 million execution. And that moved us into the neighborhood transformation business. At the same time, we were also becoming aware of nonprofits on Cape Cod who had particular expertise delivering services to resident populations around affordable housing projects, but they didn't have a technical expertise, a team of developers, and a balance sheet that would allow them to execute on real estate development. So we partnered with them, the Housing Assistance Corporation, and over the last 12 years, we've done a number of projects with them, ground up, typically around 40 units in towns all across Cape Cod. And then eventually we went to Chicago to do neighborhood transformation work in a neighborhood called Woodlawn, which is right next to the University of Chicago and the now being built Obama Library. Back then, that neighborhood was suffering from massive condominium fraud in one of the financial meltdowns. And so we partnered again with residents and local advocates to buy a troubled property. Eventually, we demolished it all. We rebuilt new units. We built a grocery store. We built a neighborhood resource center. We partnered with other neighborhood organizations around public safety and economic development initiatives. That started in around 2010. We won something called a Choice Neighborhood Grant from HUD, which kind of funded a lot of our transformation efforts. And since that time, since 2010, we've developed about 2,400 units in Chicago and in 12 different neighborhoods. So that's kind of our transformation from buying existing to now doing transformation work. We still buy existing when it's available. In the last, I would say, since the pandemic, when interest rates got really low, it almost became impossible for us to compete with private equity buying existing properties. That's probably going to change now, but the last 5 years it's been very tough for us to buy existing buildings.
Right, yeah, that makes sense.
Right, so you have served and continue to serve on a variety of boards and councils. Would you mind describing one of the boards or councils you've served on and how it relates to your work in affordable housing?
Let's see, there's a number of them. The one that comes to mind immediately is the Urban Land Institute, which is a large real estate industry organization that's actually global, but they have a US presence. And within the US presence, they have an affordable and workforce housing council of about 80 folks that are from all around the country. And actually a couple from outside of this country. And so we get together twice a year in a city. Like this year, the meeting the first meeting in the spring was in New York, and the second meeting is in Las Vegas. What we do when we go to those cities is we talk to practitioners in those cities, tour their projects, and have them come along with their governmental equivalents and tell us about the programs and procedures that they're using to create or preserve affordable housing in those jurisdictions. So we're able to do a lot of cross-learning and bring some practices back to use in our own organization. So I find that to be very helpful. Also, we're able to collaborate around legislative efforts to the extent that we need to modify HUD policy or tax policy to support the work that we're doing. Having a range of people from the industry help us do that. It's also a nice organization because we get a mix of developers at for-profit and nonprofit, lawyers, architects, planners, and financiers. So it touches a lot of industries that, as we put together advocacy approaches, being able to coordinate across industries is very effective.
Have there been any particular takeaways from that meetings that you've been able to employ in the preservation of affordable housing or any of your other endeavors?
Well, I think usually those things happen not quite that simply, but for example, I'll give you one example. One of the things that sets us apart as as a nonprofit, besides the size of our balance sheet, is the fact that we have we have a property management company that we bought as well, so that manages everything that we develop and we own. And inside and in collaboration with that property management company, we have a community impact function. So that allows us to have personnel in every project that supports our resident population. And those community impact workers implement a range of programs. So one of them that we love is called Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which Kate can tell us more about, but that allows, in a lot of times in subsidized property, your rent is determined by your income. So typically we like to say that's 30% of your income for rent. So if you think about it, there's kind of a disincentive built in, because as your rent goes up, as your income goes up, your rent goes up. So that doesn't quite allow people enough flexibility to be able to grow. So there's a program called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program that public housing authorities and a lot of nonprofits use, that basically allow families, instead of paying that increment in rent, it gets paid into an escrow account and it builds savings for them. And typically, in our case, we'll provide financial literacy training, so people learn how to monitor credit, how to take out loans, how to save money. We also partner with another company called Isuzu. I mean, a lot of times renters, typically they would not get good reports on their credit for paying their rent on time. Like when you pay your mortgage on time, it's reported to the credit company and you get a good credit rating, and then you're able to do some other things. If you were renting, that may not necessarily be the case. These folks at Isuzu with this company are basically providing a program to property owners and residents that allows them to report out your on-time rent payment to a credit agency, so that helps people build credit. And it's a very good tool, very innovative.
That's fascinating. Those both sound like great programs. So speaking of some of the different structures, financial structures for affordable housing, so the most common types of structures in Boston are subsidized rentals, restricted income, and voucher programs. So could you name maybe if there's one of those programs that you like the most, or you could go over benefit and drawbacks to the different programs?
Okay, there's a ton of programs, but I'll just talk about a couple. But I want to back up for a moment, because you asked me before who are our major external partners, and I didn't answer your question, so I'll be brief. Clearly the city, wherever we are working, in Massachusetts, so I'll keep it local, the city of Boston, the state of Massachusetts that's got a lot of financial resources that they can deploy to promote the production and preservation of affordable housing. The Housing Finance Agency, it's kind of a housing bank. It's mass housing, and runs across the state. They provide primarily debt at affordable rates. We use them on a lot of our projects. In some projects, we are partnering with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They provide a range of financial resources, including choice neighborhood grants that we referenced earlier, and also a subsidy called the Section 8 program, which is a tool that we use in a lot of our properties. That program is probably the single most important reason that we exist as a company. When we started out, we acquired a number of properties that had Section 8 contracts. So those are contracts that guarantee a rent to the owner and require that the tenant pay 30% of their income to a contract. And then beyond that, up to the rent that's determined by HUD is paid on a government contract. As an owner, that gives us a lot of stability, allows us to underwrite and finance properties, because it gives lenders and investors a lot of assurance that that income stream is going to be there to either provide debt payment or financial return to the investors. So those project-based Section 8 contracts, they travel with the property, are very important in our world to get projects done. The rest of it we can deal with, but to some extent they introduce another level of uncertainty. For example, tenant-based vouchers travel with the resident, right? Which is good in terms of promoting choice. You want people to have choice in the places that they live. It's a little harder to underwrite from an owner's perspective because that contract rent might not be there. So there's always this tug between what is the market rent and what is the voucher rent that people are going to come to you to rent. In some instances, particularly now, that's problematic for tenants who have a voucher because the market rent may be higher than the voucher rent. And so they may have a voucher, but they may not be able to use it because they may not be able to find an apartment that is at a price level that will support the voucher.
That makes sense.
So you've already touched on there being a financial incentive for landlords and developers to pursue buyouts at the end of subsidy periods. In other words, to convert affordable units to market rate. So what sort of structural reforms or partnerships do you think could disincentivize these buyouts so that affordability remains a priority over the long term?
Well, I would say there are a couple of tools that seem to be effective. There's something called a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase program. It's a TOPA for short. What that allows is if a property owner decides to sell, he has to offer it to the residents first. And they have a right to organize and then pursue their own acquisition. That's challenging sometimes because of the cost of the property. But it does create an opportunity for nonprofits like ours and other players who are interested in preserving affordability to partner with the residents to preserve their housing. In some jurisdictions, again, not in Boston, there are real estate tax exemptions that flow to affordable properties. And the economics of those real estate tax exemptions are really powerful incentives. In Texas, for example, I've viewed projects where the real estate tax bill for each affordable housing apartment if you had to pay it would be about $4,000 a unit. When you are able to zero that out by maintaining affordability as a developer, you're able to leverage that income into more debt that you can use to build projects or preserve projects. So having that tool available, we don't have it in Massachusetts yet, maybe it's been proposed, is also important. We use that in Washington, D.C. as a way to compete against private developers who are not able to access that same financial benefit. Also in Washington, D.C., they have the ability to add a transfer tax on real estate tax transfers, both commercial and residential. That transfer tax, it might be 1%. Anyway, that money goes into a trust fund, and that trust fund is used to support affordable housing. So it doesn't necessarily prevent people from opting out, but what it does is create a pool of funds that people who want to stay in can use to buy and preserve units.
Right, that's great. So one last question while we're on the topic of public policy to support affordable housing. Are there any policy changes you would advocate for on local, state, or federal levels?
Well, a couple that I just talked about: transfer taxes, real estate tax exemption for affordable housing, tenant opportunity to purchase are huge. At the local level, if we could get that through the state, that would change the resources that are available in Boston. At the federal level, a lot of what we do is driven by tax policy. And so here's a good example. When corporate real estate taxes were lowered in the last tax bill in 2017 from 35% to 21%, a lot of the benefits a lot of credits we're able to sell to corporations drastically lost value. Good for the corporations, they paid less tax. Bad for us because we had fewer resources to put into affordable housing. Getting that corporate income tax raised back would be very helpful to support our tax credit business. Also, there's another provision at the federal level, tax code, related to tax-exempt bond financing. In our world, we can utilize tax-exempt bond financing, so-called private activity bonds, to finance our construction. Those bonds come along with a tax credit, a 4% as opposed to a 9% tax credit. In order to qualify for that credit, I'm going to put a pause in here. Does everybody know what a tax credit is? I feel like I don't want to talk past the crew. We are able to get allocations of credit, which is, your avoidance of taxes. So I can sell, if I get $1 worth of credit, I can sell that to a bank that's got income. They'll pay me for that dollar of credit. Ranges from 85 cents, sometimes more than $1, because they're also buying losses that we generate that cut their tax bill down. So when their tax rate goes up, it's better for us. In the tax-exempt world, in order for us to have that 4%, access to that 4% credit, at least half of the cost of our project has to be paid for using the proceeds of the tax-exempt bonds. There is some legislative there's some legislation that's been drafted, and a lot of work is going in to try to change that 50% rule to 25%. If we get the 25% rule, that means that only 25% of our cost has to be covered by tax-exempt bonds, thereby allowing us access to a lot more 4% credit. That credit is essentially the equity in our projects. If I'm a private developer, I build using construction loans and private equity. If I have a family office or someone with a lot of cash that wants to invest in my property, I have two sources of money, and that's all I really need. I build it, I stabilize the income, and then I sell it to an institutional investor. That's their execution. For us, we have to stand in line for tax-exempt bonds, tax credits, any kind of subordinate debt that we need to write down the cost. Many times that we may have half a dozen to a dozen different sources in our capital stack required for us to cover all the costs of producing the housing. So private equities, the private guys can execute much easier. It's much easier execution. For us, it's a lot more process driven. These days, they can't find investors, so we have a little bit of advantage for a minute.
Thanks, Rodger. That was great. A couple quick questions. You talked about the construction industry and construction pricing. What are you seeing in terms of innovation around modular and panelized construction? And is there any hope that some of those factories might actually wind up in Massachusetts or in New England?
Like I said, we have one factory that's working with us in Littleton right now. I think there will be more. I mean, we'll have to get over some resistance from established labor unions. As one of the cost advantages we have when we build in a factory is that we only have to pay the prevailing wage when it's built on site right now, which the wages are regulated in the business that we're in. So if I'm building on site, there's a certain hourly wage I have to pay to each tradesperson. Or if in some cases, if the politics require that I pay union, that's a higher rate still. If I'm building in a factory right now, I'm able to build at a cost at a labor rate that the market at the market labor rate, and on site, then I'm building prevailing wage on site. So right now, there's a little bit of a tension between the unions and the manufactured housing industry, and some people want union wages in the factory, which we may get to, and maybe the efficiency of the factory build will offset the increased labor cost. We'll see what happens. I would say the project that we're building in Boston, the 13-story tower, that's a public housing transformation, is costing us about 30% more than the factory-built tower that we're building in Somerville on a square foot basis. And it's going up in half the time.
And I'm curious, I'm hearing from a lot of owners, managers of affordable housing that since the pandemic, rent collection has been a major challenge. And can you talk a little bit about that and some of the approaches that POAH is taking in low-income communities to address that?
Yeah, it's been a real challenge. I think a number of, some parts of the population who got rental assistance from governmental entity that was temporary, transitioning back to really having to pay rent on a monthly basis has been a challenge. And so I referenced a little bit earlier our community impact teams. We use those folks to try to reach out to residents and get them engaged with either additional subsidy programs or put them on payment plans as soon as possible, because no one wants to evict people. It's in DC, actually the industry there is facing a real meltdown. It's much worse than Boston, because in DC they had a local subsidy program, and then their city council passed a law that said no resident can be evicted as long as they've applied for rental subsidy. Well, they don't have any more money in their rental subsidy program, but the law never changed. So as a resident, all you have to do is go and show that you applied, and you cannot be evicted. So we've been approached by private sector owners in DC with properties that want to donate the properties to us because 30, 40, 50% of the people living in their properties aren't paying rent, and they can't get any relief from the court system. And you combine that with, the most drastic operating costs that we're suffering right now is insurance. And you combine that with increased insurance costs and half your rent going not paid, it's a quick recipe for being foreclosed and going bankrupt.
My name's Shaw Blaisdell. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here today. We all appreciate it. I was wondering, how do you navigate the challenges of balancing affordability with rising construction costs and land prices in Boston, while still ensuring long-term sustainability and quality for your developments?
Want a job? It's very hard. I mean, fortunately for us, we work in a lot of geographies, so the resources that are available in Boston and in the state really are really somewhat limited. So we finally try to find opportunities. We kind of got projects that are stacked up until 2029, 2028, because of the lack of a public resource. There's no way for us to build a less robust product. I mean, we're going to be going in the direction of sustainability, so we're doing projects now that are net zero, they're passive house. We delivered a project last year that was the first 5-story all-electric affordable senior building in the city of Boston. It was, we built it at a premium, but we were committed to the idea of getting rid of fossil fuels, like not even the backup. A lot of buildings have diesel or gas generators. We have a battery that costs $1 million to support a 50-unit senior building. But that's the way we're trying to do proof of concept on some technologies. It's hard driving down the cost. We can build slightly smaller units, but at the end of the day, the cost is what the cost is. I mean, I don't have a magic bullet. We're hoping that we're deploying this technology in Somerville. That's cheaper when compared to a traditional built tower. But if I'm building a 3-story wood frame apartment building, that technology is not going to be competitively priced. And if I'm doing a wood frame modular building in the city of Boston, if I want to try to build that in New Hampshire or Pennsylvania and truck it in, and got the transportation costs to offset that. I have heard of, in Charlestown, for example, at the public housing, they're attempting to do a system I think they got foiled by the unions, but the idea there was to build a frame of a building using CLT, and I'm spacing on what CLT stands for, mass timber, right? Build a frame and then build kitchens and baths off-site and truck them and then plug them in like little modules. But the unions did not want that work to be happening off-site, so they had to go back to a traditional approach. That being said, the politics of that are going to change because the city needs tens of thousands of units, and we have to have some break on the price in order to get that production number, because the city does not have unlimited resources, neither does the state, and they can't send it all to Boston, right? There are communities all across the state who are suffering for lack of affordable housing.
You mentioned this process called neighborhood transformation. I was curious what that kind of looked like logistically. You said something about the 200-unit city super block. Were those units occupied? And if so, what did the tenants do when you were coming in? And
Great question. It's something that we face a lot. We have to relocate folks. So there's a whole process associated with that. So in that particular case, we knew that we were it got exacerbated a little bit because we started with 200 units and the finished product only had 173 because we had to put streets in. So we lost units, we had to find places for people to leave. In some cases, people wanted to go buy a house, we helped them do that. We had to redo that project in quadrants. So we emptied one quadrant, found people to relocate off-site. We rehabbed that quadrant, moved people over, rehabbed the next quadrant, and did that. We're doing a historic mill in Attleboro, Mass. Now, where we had to relocate 50 people. It's very inconvenient. It's very costly, but it's what you need to do if you're going to rehab. Many times we can't rehab buildings with tenants in place. So work's too extensive, and sometimes there's hazardous material that needs to be abated. So we just have a big relocation process. We hire a contractor that manages it, and we try to give maximum amount of support to the residents as they go through that process. In some instances, they're away from their homes for quite a long time. In DC, I'm doing a project where we tore down public housing buildings. There's a big site. We're going to redevelop the whole thing, all new streets, all new infrastructure. Some of those people will be out of their neighborhood for 10 years.
Hi, Mr. Brown. Thank you for your insight so far. So my question was, how has POAH been involved in sort of the legislation side of efforts, like with MBTA Communities Act or the housing bond bill that just got passed?
Yeah, we do a lot of lobbying, and we work with our industry colleagues to lobby local and state officials, and that is, some of it is very official, some of it is just procedures that we have in place. For example, every time we do a ribbon cutting or a groundbreaking, we make sure that the local officials and state officials are there because we want them to see who these projects are benefiting. There's nothing better than having a U.S. senator and the mayor show up when you're cutting the ribbon on a 50-unit senior building, and the residents that are moving in are going to be there. So the next time I call that legislator and tell them, would be good if you could support this at the state level so we can do more affordable housing, they're more likely to take our call. So it's kind of an ongoing a process. So our chief of staff monitors legislative initiatives at the state, local, and the federal level. We send our staff people to Washington, D.C. on a regular basis to meet with local officials, congressmen, senators, their staff, to try to get them educated about what affordable housing is and understand that, the people that are living in affordable housing are just like me and you. I mean, an entry-level fireman, teacher, or policeman in the city of Boston is probably going to qualify for affordable housing because they certainly can't buy a $2 million triple-decker.
Hi, my name is Austin Janokiewicz. Thank you for being with us here today. I was wondering, maybe a little bit out of the context of affordable housing and more on your general career path. It talked in the beginning, you kind of went for a while about the different routes you took navigating the difficulties of your career. That sounded like it took a lot of courage. So to someone else coming out of college and kind of seeking the courage to take those leaps of faith, what advice would you have?
Ooh. you know, the real, and this is going to really sound bad, but I'm going to say
That's
it
okay.
anyway. After 2 years working for a Fortune 500 company, I realized that I didn't really care that much about the money. Like I would much rather flip hamburgers and be happy than get paid a lot of money and go to an office and be unhappy every day. And that was kind of a light bulb that went off for me. And with the help of my professors and deans here, who encouraged me to, helped me to figure out that I wanted to be someplace where I could be creative. And so, you know, being able to pursue that and trying to get a ever deeper understanding of what that means. I mean, the first time I worked with a resident organization in Roxbury to buy their apartments, some of those, and that was 25 years ago, more, 30. I'm still friends with some of those people. I can see the houses that I helped build. When I drive down Tremont Street in Boston and we see the 13-story affordable housing tower, I know that on one Saturday 12 years ago, I was working with a friend of mine who's an architect, scribbling out what that might actually look like. And it got built, which is amazing. I mean, that's why I show up every day. That's why it's fun.
That's incredible. Thank you.
So, you know, I don't say money is not important, but for me, you know, the realization that, you know, chasing the dollar wasn't it, chasing some meaningful thing, the money will come if you have passion about what you're doing.
Hi, my name is Kira. My question is actually more specifically looking at LIHTC and how, since that is like a primary source of funding for a lot of affordable housing projects,
Yeah.
I guess, did you have any criticisms of it or kind of ideas or ways that you think it can be improved to better support developers?
Oh, we could go on forever. I'll put it in the framework of an anecdote. Just before the pandemic, I got invited to go to Ireland with a bunch of housers from Massachusetts to meet our counterparts in Ireland and talk with them about how they produce affordable housing. When we talked to them about the tax credit, they could not believe that we invented such an inefficient way to generate capital to do affordable housing. You do what? You get a credit, you have to sell it to a corporation, and then you take that money to build. We just go to the government and get money to build affordable housing. Now, you know, they may have financial constraints at the government level, but we have that anyway. I mean, so the biggest criticism that I have is that it's an incredibly inefficient way to generate financial resources. Now, that being said, there is a political reality that, you know, in order sometimes to get things done, the banks and lawyers and, you know, people of different political parties need to be persuaded that it's in their interest to do it. And so we have this incredibly inefficient model that gets done. So that's kind of my big criticism about the whole thing. I guess if I thought more, I don't allow myself to think that thought too much because it drives me crazy, but at a micro level, I'd want more tax credits. I'd want the ability, one of the things I think is kind of unfair is that the tax credits that we sell, we can only sell them to corporations, so banks and insurance companies. Individuals can't buy them. And so in some of the communities that we work, it would be great to be able to offer an investment vehicle for people who live in the community and want to invest their money back in affordable housing in their community. And there are people like that who want to do that, but having a tool to do that is, you know, not in a tax credit world doesn't really work very well at all. So those are my two kind of comments. I hope they're not too off the wall. Is that okay, Neil?
I would have asked it a different way. So you're advising the Trump campaign on how to improve their housing policy. What would you suggest to them? Improve both campaigns.
I would say raise the corporate tax rate. If you don't want to go back to 35, go back to 28. Give us lower the bond threshold from 50 to 25% and increase the 9% credit across the board for the whole country. And stop talking about, immigrants being the reason that we have no affordable housing. That doesn't go anywhere. We're missing millions of units, and I'm old enough to remember when our federal government walked away from their obligation to provide affordable housing in a meaningful way. That, back in the early 80s, when government became a bad word and housing production resources really fell off the cliff.
Hi, my name is Krish, and thank you for giving this speech. I have a very generic or mundane type of a question, and I think you've sort of answered it. But do you think the government has a vested interest in keeping house prices up so that foreign investments keep on coming into the real estate market? And seeing as to how the American economy is so much tied up to real estate, we saw an example in 2008. Do you think there's like this conflict of interest where they have to keep house prices up, but they're also trying to be affordable?
Oh, I think individual homeowners and private owners may want to get prices up, but in the long term, that's a bad thing, right? People need to be able to have a roof over their head. They need to be able to be invested in their community. When a triple decker costs $1.5 million and the guy who owns it, lives in Cohasset or someplace because he's got the capital for it, that's a real loss to that community. I mean, I think the stability of our country and our economy is really very much embedded in the idea of ownership. People need to own. People need to invest where they own. If we're all renters and employees, what do we really own? What are we really invested in? We can't all work for, Jeff Bezos. So, did that answer your question?
Do you have any, suggestions or ideas, again, building onto the previous question, of keeping homeowners afloat while reducing house prices?
You produce more houses. And if you have a homeowner and you have if you want to use your house as an investment, right? That's risky. Some investments go up and some investments go down. For the good of our country, we need to produce more housing units. Supply and demand. So in theory, if we produce more houses, there'll be more supply and prices will go down. We haven't really seen that yet, but that's kind of the theory. I would say, I would say I'm not that worried about existing homeowners, particularly if they're, if they've got a house that's got a lot of equity in it and they've got a 3% mortgage, and they're trying to hold that value. I kind of get that, but that's not the business I'm in.
How do you address it, though, is my question. How can homeowners still keep the equity but make it affordable for other people to buy a house? Because if you make more units, then house prices start falling down, and people who have a loan or a mortgage on their house, they go bust.
Well, they won't necessarily go bust. There'll always be demand. Their equity, the amount of equity they have in their house may go down. But I don't really know how to address protecting an investment versus producing affordable housing. I mean, maybe someone else has a better idea about how to do that, but in some, like in Washington, D.C., for example, where rents were going so high, they really very aggressively from a government perspective pushed and advocated for a lot of apartments hitting the market. When that happened, it put a damper on rental rates and therefore value. Some people said that's a bad thing, but on the other hand, you have more people living in the city that can afford to live there. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for coming today, Mr. Brown.
Thank you very much.